Good morning and welcome to today's 20-minute update, BCF's monthly series of live streams that give you an inside look at BCF, our initiatives, and the work we're doing here in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and the entire region. Thanks for joining us. My name is Andrew Waldman with BCF. Today we're going to talk about education equity. And joining me to talk about that is Robert Ruffins, a Senior Associate of National and State Partnerships for the Education Trust in Washington, D.C. Good morning, Robert.
Yeah.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Andrew.
Before we get started, I just want to take a quick second and thank our Civic Leadership Fund donors for their support. It's because of you that we are able to provide resources like the 20-minute update. So thank you. Okay, as I said, we're going to talk about education equity today. Earlier this year, BCF commissioned the Education Trust to produce a report on inequities and opportunity achievement in Maryland public schools as part of our advocacy work on the Kirwan Commission. The data show that there are dramatic racial gaps in student outcomes regardless of family income. So saying that, I want to just launch right into this. Actually, before we get into the report itself, I just want to take a moment and define equity, because we talk about that a lot. The terms thrown around. I just want to make sure we all understand it for the purpose of this conversation. So when we say equity, what are we talking about today?
So one, thank you for having me here today, Andrew. And you are absolutely right. Equity has become a buzzword of sorts. And on one level, that's good, right? That everybody's using this term because it means more people are explicitly incorporating equity into their work. But it presents a challenge. One, because equity isn't one thing, and because everybody's using it, we have to make sure that, like, when I talk about equity and you talk about equity, we mean the same thing. And so I think equity, in the context of today's conversation, which is about inequities in resources, equity means that all students, regardless of their race or socioeconomic status, have the resources that they need to succeed. And equity recognizes and requires that the students that face the highest barriers also need the most resources. And in Maryland, as is unfortunately the case across most of the country, the students who face the highest barriers and thus need the most are low-income students and students of color.
Right. Okay, I want to take a moment and just tell the audience that this report that we're talking about today is available on our website, and I think there's going to be a scrolling thing at the bottom of the screen to tell you where to download that report. So if you want to take a look at that report while we're doing this, go ahead and download it now. But we're going to give you an overview, so you don't have to do that. Let's get right into it. I just want you to give me sort of an idea of how you compiled this report, what data went into it, those sorts of things.
Sure. So at the Education Trust, we believe in data for the people. And so we're proud to say that all the data that was used in this is from publicly available sources. In fact, most of the data actually came from sources that are part of the Maryland government themselves.
Okay.
And so we used a lot of the Maryland report card from the Department of Education. We also used the adequacy study that was done by the Department of Legislative Services for the Curran Commission, as well as the Maryland longitudinal data study. And there was national data as well, and federal data. And so we relied, and often rely, a lot on the OCR, Office of Civil Rights Data Collection, as well as the National Kids Count data and the College Board data that they put forth on advanced placement exams. And so you can, you'll see if you have a digital copy of this report that underneath the graphs there are hyperlinks that you can click on, and you can get access to the same data sets that we used to put this report together.
Great. So saying that, there is a lot of information in this report. I thought we might just start by talking about the state of things in Maryland schools today. What did you find regarding academic achievement for students across the state?
Yeah, so across the board, Maryland is not preparing Black or Latino students as well as their white peers. And so there are huge disparities in academic outcomes. And one of the things that we found in this report is that those racial disparities do not close when you're looking at income. And so they exist across the income bracket. In fact, in some cases, we saw the biggest gaps between high-income Black and Latino students and high-income white students. And so, for example, if you take Algebra 1, On average, white students on Algebra 1 are about twice as likely to meet or exceed expectations on that exam than Black or Latino students. However, when you look at high-income white students and the gap between high-income white students and high-income Black and Latino students, that gap is actually twice the size of the gap between low-income white students and low-income Black or Latino students.
Wow.
I think that it's kind of, this is on some level not a news story, but that doesn't make it any less important that the gaps are really big and they're resilient.
Yeah. Perfect lead into the next question. Why is this happening? What's driving this gap in achievement across the board?
So I think the key finding in our research is that the achievement gap in Maryland is directly related to an opportunity gap. And so there's a gap between what students actually need and the opportunities and resources that we provide to them. And right now in Maryland, we are giving Black and Latino students the least of the resources that matter most from when they enter kindergarten through when they graduate. And so these achievement gaps aren't happening in a vacuum.
Right.
And they're not the fault of kids or their families or their communities. Black and Latino students are not getting equitable access to teachers, to rigorous coursework, or to the resource that is probably on everybody's mind right now, which is funding.
Right.
And if we take that example of funding, obviously dollars don't teach kids, but the amount of dollars that you have and how those dollars are spent matter tremendously. And right now in Maryland, about 20 out of the 24 school districts are underfunded if you're looking at the adequacy numbers set in the Thornton funding formula. And we found that the districts that are serving the highest percentages of students of color are the most shortchanged under our current funding formula. And so if you look at our data, we found that as the percentage of Black and Latino students in a district in Maryland increases, so does that gap between the money that the state says you need and what you actually get. And about 45% of Black and Latino students in Maryland attend school in one of the 3 most underfunded districts in the state. Districts where if you add it all together are being underfunded by about $860 million.
Oh, that's a lot. And we have a chart actually that I wanted to show, and this kind of illustrates that. You'll see on the chart there's 2 pie charts. One is the 25% of all students in those 3 districts, and then the one below that shows you that nearly half the students of color are the ones affected in those districts. And those districts are Prince George's County, Caroline, and Baltimore City. So before we go any further, I just wanted to take a moment, and if there's anyone listening on the call today that wants to ask a question, if you're on the phone, you want to hit *6 on your keypad to unmute yourself. Any questions on the phone? Okay, hearing none. Also, we are taking questions on Facebook today, so if you have a question, just go ahead and type it in the comment box on the Facebook live stream. And we'll have another chance to ask questions in a second. So we know the drivers of the gap. How can we close that gap? Can you just tell me in 1 minute?
Yeah, so to start, we cannot divorce our conversations about closing the achievement gap from our conversations about closing the opportunity gap. We make choices about what resources students get, and right now we are choosing to allocate our resources inequitably. And so for one, to start, we have to make sure that the districts that are serving the highest percentages of students of color are given the resources they need to be successful, that they have that really good, strong pipeline of high quality teachers, that they are able to offer really good courses, and that they have a sufficient per pupil funding formula. I think 2, we can be transparent. We can make sure that we are producing timely and accessible data that is honest about where these inequities are in terms of outcomes, and is also being clear and honest about how we're allocating resources and are we allocating them equitably. And then lastly, we can have a really clear accountability system that holds every adult accountable for making sure that they're equitably distributing resources and making sure that everybody's prioritizing closing these gaps. a new set of school ratings just came out, and right now in Maryland's accountability system, because it uses its 1 to 5 system is based on school averages, which are unfortunately really good at hiding these inequities, it is possible to get a 4 or 5 even if Black and Latino students aren't doing that well. And that does not send a clear message that the performance of those students matter, nor does it particularly incentivize folks who prioritize closing those gaps.
I just picked up on this as you were giving me that answer. You said hold adults accountable. Is that somehow separate from how these rating systems work now? Or are you proposing that we sort of flip from looking at student achievement to making sure that the adults are actually giving kids the opportunities to achieve?
So what I mean by that is that we need systems that that racial equity is embedded in them, right? And so we have I think it's human nature, right? When we say we're going to measure something, what we measure is what we get, right? And so if you're in your accountability system, say that part of how we're going to evaluate schools and school districts is how successful they are in closing these gaps, or are they equitably distributing those resources, that will incentivize all the adults at every level, from the top to the bottom, to say that closing these gaps and doing equity on the front end, which is providing folks the right resources, is important. So that's what we mean when we say an accountability system that has racial equity embedded in it.
Got it. Okay, just wanted to give anyone a chance to ask a question. If they're on the phone, you want to hit *6 to unmute yourself. Also, if you're on Facebook, go ahead and type your question right into the Facebook comment box. Any questions on the phone? Okay, so we just got some news last night, late in the day, that the Kirwan Commission, which was sort of the driver of why we had this report commissioned, is not going to release their funding formula until 2019. Or excuse me, until 2020, after this legislative session is over. So we're obviously disappointed, those of us who have been looking forward to seeing these recommendations for a long time. But because we can't really wait for reform to come, we need this now. But having said all that, we do have some preliminary data and some preliminary recommendations from the commission. Do you see any bright spots in what has come out so far that we can sort of look to in regard to equity?
Sure. So I think that, for one, the good news is that the current commission has been clear that they want to prioritize racial equity, that they want to make sure that resources are distributed more equitably, and that they want racial equity to be a component of the government's accountability system. And I think that they have kind of put their money where their mouth is in some respects. And I think an example of that is the consideration of allocating additional funds for schools and districts that are serving high concentrations of students living in poverty. However, I think the question remains whether or not we're going to articulate a really clear strategy for racial equity. And many of the proposals that are talked about in these discussions often focus much more on the gaps related to income than the gaps related to race. And to be clear, there are profound opportunity gaps for low-income students, and we have an obligation to close those gaps. However, I think one thing that our research on this has made clear is that the gaps that relate to income, while related to the gaps related to race, are not the same. And so income cannot just be used as a proxy for race. And I think based on where we are as a state, this is what we have to accomplish in this next phase, right? We have to articulate a really clear and explicit strategy for closing these gaps. We have to fund on that strategy. We have to hold folks accountable for doing it, because as I said before, right? We are making choices,
right?
And we could make different choices. And I think also for myself, we sometimes talk about this as if it's a story about the future, right? But 50% of Maryland public school students today are Black Latino students. And so this is not a story about other people's children. It's not a story about Maryland's future. It's a story about right now. We have to make sure that that story has a happy ending.
Right.
Because, you know, like everything I think that makes Maryland great, politically, morally, economically, like hinges, right, on how we're serving these students. And, you know, we're the author of that story, and I think that, you know, the great thing about being the author is that you have a pen in your hand and you get to write the story. And I think these gaps can close, and I think they have to close.
Yeah.
Sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I totally agree. So this just popped into my head. When you were all putting this report together, was there anything in it that surprised you at all about Maryland specifically?
Yes, and I think that, you know, obviously the conversation about the achievement gap is not new, and it's not new to Maryland, right? And, you know, we are not the first people to look at this. The current commission is not the first time the state has tried to address these gaps, but I am amazed that given that we've been talking about this for so long, how deep and salient some of these gaps are. I think I was surprised at like how clear and how across almost all of the resources that matter most, there is such a clear gap between what we say students need and what they actually get. And you know, while it's like easy to logically proceed from that to say that like, okay, well, if we're not giving students what they need, then there's probably going to be big gaps in outcomes that we're getting. But like once again, even knowing that, I was surprised at how big some of these gaps are, because you know we are a state that has proven, and we like to talk about being, you know, a top state for education.
Yes.
And we've proven that in some respects we can get there for certain groups of students. And the fact then that we're not getting there for all groups of students, I think is like really surprising, because Maryland does know how to educate students well. The gap is, are we educating all students well?
Yes. This is kind of related to that question. We have this report here, lots of great information. How can community groups, you know, someone who is in the community working with their local school district, how can they use a report like this to make change?
Sure. So I think, one, we have to be clear, right? That like, data is really good, but like data does not on its own change policy, right? And I think one of the things that we found, not just in Maryland but across the country, is that, you know, you need data, you need policy recommendations, but you also need public demand, right? So folks need to hear from you. You know, folks need to know that there's a demand for transparency, that there's a demand for accountability, that there's a demand for more resources. And so like I think the first thing, and the reason why we believe in like leading with data, is having as many honest and explicit conversations about what the gaps are as possible. And that's not just between people and their legislators and their policymakers, that's inside of communities, right? That's, you know, between you and, you know, your parents, between teachers and students, about being really honest about where we are and what are the interventions that we're taking, are they working, and, you know, really building that shared value and shared demand for doing better than we're doing now. So, you know, like show up, pay attention, demand data, make sure that it's like clear and that it's reporting what it says it's going to be reporting, and then use that data to, you know, have really good conversations with folks and make sure that the interventions and policies that you're recommending are like based on data and based on like the best practices.
Demand data. That's great. Okay, we actually have we have about a minute left, but I may extend this just a minute or two more so we can get to these two questions. So this is a question from Brianna on Facebook. Do you know of any examples of other jurisdictions of remedies that were employed to close opportunity gaps that are race-based and have been successful?
Sure. One quick qualification being that there's no place in America, unfortunately, I can point to and say, do absolutely everything they've done because they've completely ended educational inequities. However, there are examples of folks who have prioritized it and have put forth promising plans. So a couple quick examples. One is North Carolina. that was specifically looking to tackle the problem of inequitable assignment of students to advanced placement math courses. And so earlier this year, they passed legislation saying that any student that scores a 5 on their end of course exam, that being the highest score, is automatically placed in advanced math courses. Another example is Tennessee, which actually has a state equity strategic plan.
Wow.
And as a part of their plan, they've really focused on recruiting and retaining teachers of color. And so they are using a portion of their Title II Part A grants to, a portion of their Title II Part A funds to issue grants to school districts specifically to recruit teachers of color. And then we can also look to the federal law, ESSA. You know, it is not perfect, but it does contain strong language and gives states authority to close these racial equity gaps. And so, for one, ESSA does say that states can use the performance of Black and Latino students as a way of holding school districts accountable in their rating systems. Also, the law is very clear that it is that you cannot have Black and Latino and low-income students disproportionately taught by ineffective, out of field, or inexperienced teachers. And so we have resources from federal law, we have best practices from other states, and so it all is not lost. Like, there are people who are doing things that are working.
Great, great. One other question, and this will be the last question because we're over time. What are the other top takeaways from the report?
Yeah, I think that, you know, obviously the big one is that there's this huge gap, and that the gap doesn't just go away when you look at income. But I think that the takeaway that I have is one, actually, of optimism, is that, like, in some level, the report would be much scarier, and I think it is kind of scary, but it would be much scarier if we didn't see these opportunity gaps, right? But the fact that we see that we are not starting from the right place, right, means that there are things under our control, right? It means that, you know, far from the conversations that we sometimes have, which is either focusing totally on out-of-school factors, it shows that there are things that the district can do, things that the state can do, things that teachers in schools can do that can make a difference, right? And if we do more of the things that we know students need, if we give them those good teachers, if we give them coursework, if we give them the money that pays for all those things, then, like, I'm optimistic, and I think that the data suggests that we'll see some of these gaps close. And so I think, like, that note of optimism, you know, it's kind of a silver lining, but the idea that, you know what, we're actually not doing everything that we can, and thus there's so much more that is under our control that we can do, is like I think I hope that people don't miss from this.
Good to end on a note of optimism. Okay, so we're actually past time. I want to thank Robert Ruffins from the
Thank you.
Education Trust for coming in and doing this. We really appreciate it. If you want to get the whole report, it's on our education advocacy website, which is education.baltimorecommunityfoundation.org. You can also find some updates on other things that are going on in Kerwin there. Sign up for e-news, and yeah, it's a great website. Take a look.
Yeah.
And we'll be back next month in January for our next 20-minute update. Thank you to our Civic Leadership Fund donors for this opportunity, and have a great holiday.